When we talk about epithelial tissue, we have to talk about skin. And skin is probably my favorite organ actually to talk about. So skin is comprised of multiple different kinds of tissue comprising a total organ, and it's very simple, but it's also very complex. So here we have a slice through some skin, and what we find first is that skin is comprised of three main layers. The outer layer is the epidermis, the middle layer is the dermis, and the bottom layer is the hypodermis. Now, a lot of places are referring to the hypodermis as the subcutaneous layer, and they're trying to get away from the idea of hypodermis. I personally don't like that, because I think hypodermis is much more descriptive and much more actually useful in describing what's going on. Sub means underneath, cutaneous meaning cutaneous layer of some sort, but that's not really specific. But if we talk about a hypodermis, hypo means definitely underneath, directly underneath, and dermis means the dermis, so the layer directly underneath the dermis. And that's much more descriptive than saying it's underneath some sort of lining somewhere. So if we look at the epidermis, it is comprised mostly of dead tissue. And only the bottom couple of layers of cells is actually living tissue. So if we look here at this graphic, this squiggly line here at the bottom is the bottom edge of the epidermis. So everything above that is epidermis, and only this first couple of layers of cells here is actually alive. And then after it gets a little bit further away from the bottom edge of the epidermis, then it starts to become dead tissue. And it's dead tissue because it's getting farther and farther away from the blood supply. And if you don't have a blood supply, you don't have food, you don't have oxygen, and so you very quickly die in that process. That really means that we're covered with an outer layer of tissue that is dead stuff. And that's really wonderful because the skin's primary function is to protect the body and to help regulate what comes into and out of the body. If your outer surface is dead stuff and you damage that layer of dead stuff, so what? It was dead. It can't get really hurt if it's already dead. So that's a nice disposable layer of protection. And that then means, though, that you need to replace this. So approximately once a month, the entire epidermis is replaced. That means you're constantly sloughing off dead skin cells. Everything you touch, everything you walk past, your house is full of your dead skin cells. And for many people, dead skin cells make up a significant percentage of the dust of your house. If you have dust mite problems, the dust mites are actually there eating your dead skin cells. So do a better job of cleaning up your dead skin cells and you'll have fewer dust mites. The middle layer there, the dermis, is a little bit more exciting, but what we see here in the dermis is actually the hair roots. But notice that they're actually comprised of epidermis. So the epidermis in this case takes a deep dive down into the dermis where you have a hair. So hair, and we'll find out a little bit later, fingernails and toenails are actually specialized epidermis. So the dermis does dive down in those areas. But most of the rest of the dermis we find connective filler tissue. We're going to find some muscles here, and you'll notice those muscles, the erector pili muscles, are attached to the bottom edge of the epidermis in one location and then attached to the root of a hair. And when that muscle contracts, it's going to cause the epidermis to pull together, and that actually makes the hairs stand up, and it causes the skin to somewhat contract, maybe wrinkle a little bit, maybe form things like goosebumps. Directly associated with those hairs, we have some oil glands, and those are going to produce oil that lubricates the hair, sort of a built-in conditioner or moisturizer for the hair. The more often you wash your hair, the less of that natural lubricant is there, meaning your hair gets drier, it gets more frizzy, and it gets more likely to become brittle and damaged. I'm not saying to stop washing your hair, but I am saying that there's a happy medium between washing the hair the right amount and washing the hair too much. This is a well-documented problem. This is why a lot of shampoos have moisturizing agents in them, and then you might use conditioner on a regular basis. And that's trying to cancel out some of the effects that have occurred by washing off the oils the natural lubricants, the natural conditioners of the hair, washing that off, and so you have to replace it with an artificial substance at that point. Here in the dermis, we're going to find blood vessels, we're going to find nerves, and we're going to find sweat glands. And they didn't do a very good job of drawing this, but down here we have a sweat gland, and it would actually come up here and dump out onto the surface right here. So sweat glands dump their contents onto the surface of the skin, as we know, sweat. Here's a little nerve right here that's for detecting touch. You see they're scattered throughout there. And then we get deeper down in the dermis, we have bigger nerves there. That's for detecting heavier touch or pressure. So in the dermis we have sweat glands, we have blood vessels and nerves, we have muscles. And then the rest of it is mostly filler tissue. We get down here to the hypodermis, and the hypodermis consists of the origins of the blood vessels, the origins of the nerves, and fat. And so that fat is there to cushion underlying organs. It actually helps to cushion the skin a little bit too, to give it a little bit of elasticity and flexibility. It helps to keep the skin upright and fully, let's say, stretched out. And if you look at newborn babies and you look at old people, there's something they have in common, and that is a reduced amount of adipose tissue in the hypodermis. So that starts to give wrinkles. So the newborn baby, especially if it was born a little bit early, doesn't have that fat deposited yet. Older people have lost that fat, and then the skin starts to collapse down into those areas where the fat is no longer present, starting to form then wrinkles. One possible treatment for wrinkles is to actually inject fat into those areas to refill the hollow areas, if you will, and plump the skin back up again. Here is a really, really cool picture of skin. We can see the outer layers here are actually quite flaky looking. They're quite dry looking because they are dead stuff after all. And then here would be the bottom edge of that, and then we've got the dermis underneath that, and then down here below we would have hypodermis a little bit later on. But that's just a really fabulous picture of skin as it looks under a microscope. In this case, a very sophisticated microscope called a scanning electron microscope that actually gives us a picture that we couldn't possibly get with just a regular microscope like you might find in your average science lab. What we have here are a couple of pictures of different skin cancers. And there are actually 3 different common types of skin cancer. Only 2 of them are pictured here, basal cell carcinoma and then melanoma. There's also another one called squamous cell carcinoma. But regardless, those 3 comprise most forms of skin cancer that you're going to run into. And the picture on the left looks kind of rough and nasty looking. It's abnormally colored. It's flaky. It's irregular in every way you can imagine. And that actually is probably one of the nastier looking cases of basal cell carcinoma that I've personally seen. But the picture on the right here, melanoma, I really don't like that one because that very much belittles the nastiness of melanoma. Often it looks a lot worse than that. But the real question at hand here is, what is it that makes this cancer, and how do you know by looking at something? So let's go through the list actually that the doctor is going to use. And they're going to use these criteria right here. The ABCs of skin cancer, you can look at A being asymmetry. So what is the surface of this spot like? Is it nice and smooth and flat, or is it bumpy and have a rough, uneven surface to it? And the shape, is it a nice balanced shape, or is it irregular in shape? Border irregularity talks about the edges. Are the edges nice and smooth and circular? And do they very cleanly have a starting and stopping point? C is color. The darker something is, typically the more concerning it is considered to be, probably because that's indicating depth of growth into the skin. The deeper it goes, the more likely it is to break off and float around somewhere else in the body. And at that point, we would say it has metastasized, which means it's spreading to somewhere else. Skin cancer is 100% curable, as long as it's only in the skin. The solution typically is to surgically remove the skin. We could also use freezing with liquid nitrogen. We could use burning or surgical removal. We could use medications in the form of chemotherapy as well, but most of the time it's going to be dealt with a somewhat surgical approach. But if it starts to metastasize and go to other parts of the body, then it might become liver cancer or lung cancer, or wherever it happens to land, it will become that kind of cancer, and then you have a really much more difficult problem at that point. So skin cancer doesn't kill, but skin cancer that spreads can kill. So there's a key distinction there. Diameter. Anything bigger or round than the eraser on a pencil is cause for concern. And just like with color, the bigger it gets, probably the deeper it's growing, the more likely it is to metastasize. Elevation is the same idea as well. In this case, the higher it protrudes above the level of the rest of the skin, just like sort of an iceberg. You see part of it above, and part of it has gone down underneath. So the higher it goes, probably the lower it's going as well. And again, we're worried about metastasis. Our last little statement here is evolving. So if any of these 5 criteria are changing from what they were to something else, that's concerning. And I guess I should go back to the color thing. It doesn't have to get darker. It could get lighter, or irregular coloration would also be a concern. So anything that's different than the rest of your skin's coloration is a problem there. But if any of these 5 criteria are changing, that's something to pay attention to, because change in this case is not a good thing. That means additional growth. That means additional mutation perhaps. So if you have skin problems, as I do, you go to the doctor on a regular basis. And so I go to the dermatologist at least once a year for a checkup. And they have mapped out my body with all the little irregular features all over my skin, and there are a lot of them. And every year they revisit those spots and measure them again. They look at them for changes, and they look at what their description was the last year and see if it still matches that description or if it's evolving. And if it's evolving, then they're probably going to look at removing it. And I've had that done far more times than I would like to think about. So let's go back to those pictures we just looked at and apply these criteria. If we look at the basal cell carcinoma here, would we say that it's asymmetrical? Its shape isn't even and balanced. Its surface isn't nice and flat and smooth. So the shape is very irregular. It's got a lot of deviation in its shape. The surface is very rough and scaly. So some other characteristics to look at are scaliness of the skin spot. If it's oozing some sort of fluid or blood, that's of concern as well. So certainly this particular basal cell carcinoma and the melanoma both meet criteria of asymmetrical. When we talk about the border irregularity, the basal cell carcinoma is kind of, I've seen a lot worse edges, but it does kind of fade in and out a little bit. So, and it certainly has some irregular shape to it. So that's somewhat checking that criteria. If we look at the melanoma, it's definitely fading slowly out. There's not necessarily a nice clean line as to where it started and where it stops. So both of these checking box B. C was color. We can definitely agree that both of these have abnormal pigmentation to them. And the melanoma is a little bit more towards the dark side. The basal cell here is bouncing back and forth between an abnormal pink, a brownish color, and then a black color in the middle of that. So definitely got some crazy color going on there. They both satisfy that. D is diameter, and we really don't have good perspective here on this, but I'm going to suggest that the basal cell carcinoma here in this picture does meet that obviously bigger than a pencil eraser criteria. This melanoma, on the other hand, isn't going to be that awfully big, so size alone doesn't necessarily mean anything. E is elevation, and it's a little hard to see in this first picture here, but the basal cell carcinoma is going to be a little bit elevated. The melanoma has a really big lump to it, so you can see that's definitely an elevation thing going on there. And if we were to look at both of these, I suspect we would have seen some evolution occur over the course of time. So if we'd looked at them a couple of months before this, they might have looked a little different than they do in this picture. Now, of the different kinds of skin cancer, melanoma is by far the scariest one. It no doubt kills the most people, and that is because it metastasizes the fastest. So it goes from skin to somewhere else in the body far quicker than the basal cell or squamous cell carcinomas do. As a matter of fact, if you're diagnosed with basal cell or squamous cell carcinoma, the doctor might actually say, yes, you have cancer, but we're not going to take it out, we're just going to watch it, because it is a very slow-growing sort of thing, and in some cases they might opt to observe rather than to treat. That's not my personal opinion. My opinion is if it's cancer, it needs to go. But because those others are relatively slow-growing, it is something that you have some time with. Melanoma, you don't have time with. You can't wait around for another 6 to 8 months and watch it and see what happens. Because again, it's very aggressive about spreading. So something that's diagnosed as melanoma really needs to come off as immediately as possible. The others, you do have a little bit of wiggle room with, but in my personal opinion, cancer in any form, no matter how slow growing, should be dealt with as aggressively as possible. Here's that idea of the fingernail and toenails originating from skin. So here we have the skin of the finger in this case. And you can see, just like with the roots of hairs, we have the skin. It folds deeper into the tissue and then back underneath. And this nail here directly originating from the epidermis, just like the hair did. It's just a little bit bigger, a little bit more significant projection of material there. Another criteria that's involved in this chapter is the idea of homeostasis and maintaining homeostasis. So how is it that your body is able to keep things nice and stable? Remember, homeostasis is the ability to keep things stable even when the environment around is changing. And temperature of your body is one of those things that becomes very obvious and very dramatic sometimes in your body's response. So we want the body, let's say, to be 98.6 degrees, give or take a little. And let's say that the temperature gets off a little bit. In this case, let's say you get too cold. Maybe you went outside and it was rainy and it was windy and it was a couple of months ago when we actually had some cold weather for about 5 minutes at a time. And so that then would start dropping your body temperature. And your body would then say, temperature's going down. We don't like that, and it would then cause you to have a reaction to, in this case, start to shiver and increase your body's metabolism for a little bit, and that would generate heat. That heat would then get you back to the 98.6, and once you got there, you would stop shivering because you've achieved the objective, which was to warm you back up. So what we're seeing here in this example, whether it's to go up or to go down, is called negative feedback. And in negative feedback, the outcome of your response turns off the response. So here it's designed like a furnace, and when the thermostat detects a temperature change, it turns on the furnace. Once the heat is produced to warm up, in this case the house, the thermostat turns off the furnace because you've done the job. You don't want to overdo it. The same sort of thing could happen if you got too hot. In that case, the house gets too hot, the air conditioning turns on, and gets it back down to a cooler temperature. So that's a constant process that's going back and forth. And here's the example of that going on in your body with getting too hot and too cold. So when you get too cold, again, you shiver to warm up. When you get too hot, you sweat. And both of those things will stop once you get the temperature back to where it needs to be. That's the most common kind of feedback system in the body because it's simple. It works, and it ensures that you don't overdo anything. The outcome turns off the initial response, very quickly stabilizing things. Now, there is another feedback mechanism that can be utilized in the body, but this is only found in a limited number of places because there are only so many things that we want to overdo. And so that's called positive feedback. And in positive feedback, the outcome of your response triggers more of the response. So it becomes more of a domino effect or a snowball effect. And a couple of places where that happens, one is with bleeding. If you cut your finger, it starts to clot. And we'll get to tissue repair later on in blood clotting when we talk about blood. But the short story here is that platelets will start to arrive at that area of damage and start to plug off the bleeding. When a platelet attaches, it calls for another platelet. When that platelet attaches, it calls for another platelet. So you start to get a domino effect of calling for more and more and more platelets. And what you're doing is you're very rapidly stopping the bleeding. You're sealing off that damaged area. And it very slowly turns off once there's nothing left to stick to, once the damage is covered up. But that pretty much overreacts and does more than it would need to. And the thought there is it's better to stop the bleeding more than you need to, rather than not stop it enough and continue bleeding. So a little bit of overreaction in that case is okay. Sometimes the body gets carried away with itself far too much and spontaneously forms blood clots where there's no need to. And in that case, your body is just getting too much aggressive with this positive feedback mechanism, and then you need to do some things to cancel that out. Another example of positive feedback would be with contractions during labor and childbirth. So, ladies, if you've had a child, or if anyone has ever been around a labor and delivery process, you'll know that it starts out relatively mild, with some contractions that are barely detectable, not necessarily seeming to be a big deal, and they're relatively far spaced out. But the more contractions an individual experiences, the faster they come, so the less time there is between them, and the more aggressive they get. So it starts from a mild feeling, to a moderate feeling, to a mild inconvenience, to a major inconvenience, and occasionally results in the idea of jumping up in bed and smacking people. Hopefully that's not anyone's experience, but I'm told it could happen. So basically that is the uterus contracting harder and harder and faster until there's nothing left to contract on. So when that baby comes out, the idea is we don't want to push baby part way out and then stop. This is something we don't want to do halfway. We're going to do it such that we know it completed. And once we think it completed, we're going to keep contracting anyway. So once the baby comes out, contractions do slow down. And within a couple of hours to a day or so, perhaps mama's not noticing the contractions as much anymore. But those contractions are actually going to continue for weeks after the baby's out. The first thought was keep pushing just to make sure you got everything out. We don't want to miss anything in there. And then there are some advantages towards restoring the body to its pre-pregnancy condition that those contractions are going to help carry out. And we'll talk about those when we get to reproduction in a later chapter. So that's a handful of cases in which you want to get a bigger and bigger and bigger effect. And in both of those cases, when it does turn off, it turns off very slowly. And those were things that it was okay to overdo. But most of the things that happen in the body is not okay to overdo it. And so that means most of your functions are going to work on a negative feedback kind of principle. Hopefully this all made sense and you learned a lot. If you have any questions, make sure you ask those in the discussion board, for this is now Unit 2. And have a good day. I'll see you next time.